Press the button. Now, in advance, I'm actually going to my Twitter now. So now what I do is I go to my Twitter, right? And then I need to confirm that I'm really live, man. I am telling you, don't believe technology. Just don't believe it.
I don't trust it at all.
Don't. I'm telling you, I'm going to spend my last years in a shack writing a manifesto. Okay. Well, I'm not live yet. And
someone actually did that, and it didn't work out so well for them.
Yeah, but I'm going to do it really good. Mine's actually, his manifesto was actually spot on. That's the crazy thing. Okay, so now I'm also on YouTube. I'm live 2 ways. So now I'm going to check them both simultaneously. I've almost got this down to a science. I had it down to a science, but then what happened is now I stream both ways. Mm-hmm. So it's different. So now I go to my videos, right? I'm going to go to live, and I'm going to see if I'm genuinely live. And I click the button. I did it. I did it again. I'm double live, and I see people here. And thank you so much for being here, Chuck. I see people here, and but that doesn't mean we were live before, because it could be like a scheme type of thing. It could be like Twitter taking over. So now what I do, I'm live. I checked everything. Now I lower my music, right? Okay.
I love that music, though. It's perfect ambiance for what we're going to be discussing.
Ambiance is important. And you've been listening to my music for the last half an hour in the background. So didn't it feel like it felt like you were in a beautiful elevator, right? Or in a doctor's office.
I have never been more soothed in my life.
I only listen to calming music. I don't listen to rap music. I don't listen to any of that nonsense. And when I'm in the gym, I work out to audio books. That's what I listen to, audio books. I even go to sleep to audio books.
Only the ones that are narrated by and read by Morgan Freeman, though, right? That mellifluous, just beautiful tone he's got.
No, I only do history, philosophy. That's all I do. So that means that, and I, with an emphasis on Hellenic history, and so it's very bloody. So I go to sleep sometimes. I'm like, oh, this is going to be bad, but I've got to do it. So we are live. I have proven we are live. So thank you so much for being here, Chuck. And Shivan, thank you so much for joining us. Bonjour to you as well. And I speak several languages fluently, I speak several languages, right? And I speak them really well, except I mess them all up with my pronunciation. So
I do the same with English.
Yeah, so I'm going to try saying comment allez-vous, but that might not be right. So now we are live. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us. And T. Kinder, thank you as well, who says, I believe whatever the screen in front of me says. Yeah. But it could be fake news. I really actually worry about that. So, okay. And thank you so much for being here as well, Bozo Brizo, and who says, and Beyonce. So, yeah, I suppose.
That's awesome.
We all are. So I want to thank you so much for being here, Ross. And would you be kind enough to, you've got a long story to tell, right? You've got a lot to tell people. So let's start at the beginning with who you are and who you were. And that would be awesome. Is that all right?
Yeah, man.
Okay, cool.
Graduated college in the mid 2000s, had grown up playing sports and really thought, well, I want to be a professional athlete, and, dreaming big and being able to play on that level probably wasn't in it for me. So the big dreams went away. I decided I wanted to do sports marketing, kind of geared my college education around that. And once I started to realize that for every 1,000 people that had that sort of background, maybe one or two of them were getting very low paid internships, turned my attention more towards something practical, and had grown up in the agriculture industry. Grandpa and dad were both veterans of the Air Force, and then both got out, decided that they wanted to get into the agriculture world. And I did internships as a seed corn intern. I worked for a fertilizer company. So very marinated in kind of where the food comes from and where it goes, and really realized how important that was to understanding, as a lens for the world. So I went to work for Archer Daniels Midland, doing the basic thing that every college grad does there, and went into the commodity trading program. And I really thought it was going to be like Trading Places, right? I loved that movie growing up. I thought it was, we're gonna buy and sell, and we're gonna do all these things, and it wasn't really that for what I was doing. And I grew very quickly to find that my escape was going outside. And at the grain elevator I worked at one of the larger elevators in ADM's network, and I got to go outside and dump trucks and stand on top of the train and sub-zero temperatures, in a blizzard, and load grain. And I really began to appreciate the grunt work and that ground level effort that goes into feeding the world. All of the corn and soybeans we were loading was going to the poultry mills and to the feed mills. They were going to Georgia, and I got to go down and tour that and see my first poultry processing plant. And that really exposed me so much to the reality of the world and where our food comes from and how it gets there. So I decided to make logistics kind of my new emphasis. ADM didn't have enough people working in the containerized export business, so I started doing that. Moved up to Chicago, Illinois, started punching containers out of Chicago as fast as I could, full of DDGs, distillers dried grains with solubles, soybean meal, some wet WDGS, wet distillers grains, and a lot of corn. And that was fulfilling in a really weird, odd way. Was learning that mechanics of the world, and I began to sort of feel like a bit like a garbage man, doing an underappreciated job that keeps civilization moving. And it very quickly spiraled into me learning about the ships, learning about the rail infrastructure, the ports, doing a lot of back and forth with colleagues across the ocean in China. Primarily was, of course, the demand bull during that time. And it became an obsession. And was able to continue through the industry, even after leaving ADM, moving it back into selling of identity preserved grains, helping the farmers grow them, contracting, everything from fertilizer and seed selection all the way through to delivery overseas into Japan, China, Taiwan, places like that. And it was, for being a young guy, I was 24, I was 25, and I had hundreds of millions of dollars worth of business that was being transacted on the back of my work. And it was amazing. And got into the traceability, identity preservation more deeply, helped develop a software product that is now one of the leading solutions for farmers who want to be able to prove what's being grown. Farmeron does a bit of it. They were invested into by Google. But there was a company that came before that did it well, did it right, and mostly did it on the back of all the processes and effort that I put in writing all of those processes. Everything from the first time you put the plow in the ground, so to speak, to till that soil, all the way through to harvest, all the way through to delivery at the end. We built the first ever system in the world that could prove exactly where that bushel of corn, say, where it was grown, how it was grown, all the fertilizer and chemicals that was used on it, what bin it was stored into, what truck it left on, what ship it went on to get overseas. It was an absolute labor of love. I felt like a failure when I left that company because we didn't have any traction or adoption. It has become very, very strong player in the market. And so I got to have all these really interesting experiences very early in my career that exposed me to some of the real essential sort of gut level ways the world actually operates. Not what we think it operates on based on what the news tells us or based on what we read in the New York Times or what we see on Twitter or Facebook, but really truly the mechanics of how it worked. And I loved it, and I still do. As my career progressed, I left agriculture to some extent, began to get more into shipping of government cargo, private sector cargo. I got to do some really interesting stuff as far as shipping things like ammunition to places I didn't even have a name for, let alone being able to find on a map before I started doing those shipments. And when you get into the operational side of international transportation, of air freight or ocean freight, you, again, just like agriculture did for me, once I started actually riding in the tractors with the farmers and you know, helping them feed their pigs and their cows. When I started doing the documents and I started being involved in the commercial invoice side, and I started learning how free trade zones worked and what they're really about, when I started learning how the ports worked and getting to get out on the ships and see these things, I really realized that logistics was a lens into the world. It is the way in which we all transact. You know, financial markets and logistics are really the two ways, if you want to understand commerce and how it works. That's really what it comes down to. Try to understand one or both of those things. But I also realized as I started to move some different types of material that there was a sort of dawning realization when I began to study history, you know, more deeply and look into the origins of the Silk Roads, look into, you know, the way the Romans and the Greeks and everybody else began to conduct themselves in antiquity. I realized that if we can't trade, we fight. That's really the two ways that humanity has to resolve that friction of I need, I want, I must have. And so I began to study war and conflict more deeply. I began to really throw myself into that. That got me into John Boyd around 2010. And with John Boyd, I began to see the world through a system, what I didn't know at the time, I didn't have a word for, but is now systems thinking. You know, Knevin and Uda and some of these different frameworks that we have for categorizing the ways in which humans behave and operate. And I think I began to write on those things. I began to adopt principles of Uda and Mission Command, F3EAD, all these different models that'll be familiar to people from the, you know, from the U.S. military. I began to sort of synthesize those and incorporate those into my mental models for logistics and trade, and ended up getting published alongside a bunch of fantastic military authors. This is, you know, you know, I was the lone civilian writing in that book, someone who'd never been in the military, just had a lot of exposure to it through my work. And it was fascinating to be able to say, how do you take Uda and how do you take Mission Command and apply that to the domain of civilian logistics or commercial logistics models? And so as I begin to synthesize and play with these ideas, it's just continued to expand over the years into something that's not only an intellectual pursuit, but as I apply it back into my life and into my career, working with my clients, working with stakeholders overseas and here, it has become a very, that knowledge, whatever it is that lives in my brain, that interest I have in these very sort of unusual things that have become this skill stack, to borrow Scott Adams' term, it's become a bit of a competitive advantage for people who work with me.
Okay, now I'm sorry. You know, these are like dinners with friends, right? So, and so many people are joining us for like a big dinner with friends, which is awesome. And you're the guest of honor. And I'm the host kind of, right? And I'm rude, but I'm rude because we're friends. Everybody here is all friends. So I just kind of raised my hand because I don't want you to skip the part where you've got your business now, describing your business now, and then we're really going to get into the forensics of it because it's very crucial to understand, as well as you've got a dual identity, right? And you know, we discussed it before, right? And now you're a little bit shy, but I think it's important because everybody on Twitter knows you, and there are so few people that are actual experts on logistics, and there's so few people who understand what happens next with logistics, because people think of logistics as only something that now exists on Earth. They don't appreciate that there's space logistics now, and you and I have discussed this. So tell me about your business, and then tell me about like your Batman and Bruce Wayne type of thing. Is that cool?
Yeah. So, you know, sort of by day, right? I work in the international ocean freight industry. I work for an NVOCC. Do the regional sales thing. My boss actually follows me on Twitter, which is really hilarious. So it's kind of like I got to be mindful of what I say. But he's great people, and so I get to really spread my wings and talk about some of these like really granular, detail-oriented things that are really kind of more germane just to my industry, just to the nuts and bolts of moving containers around, and to some extent air freight as well. Love it, and I'll never leave it. What I also do though is because of some of my unique experience in the world, some of my things that I've done transportation wise, you know, people that I've been able to deal with, one of the gifts that I've really developed is the ability to may move cargo that isn't, so much normal, right? It's not shoes coming in from China or grain exporting from the United States. It's very difficult. It's, things that go boom, right? Lots of explosives, lots of highly hazardous chemicals, energy products, a lot of exposure and experience in that. And that's sort of given me this really nice perspective on being able to consult to or advise various entities, not just here in the US, but also in other countries. You get a lot of these calls, random weird calls, and over time you take enough of these calls and you start to realize what these people's needs are, and there's some consistency to the needs. So when I begin to study into those topics, I begin to build those relationships with the manufacturers of the products, or with the hard asset owners who actually own the planes or the trucks or the rail or the ships. I begin to synthesize all of this data and start to be able to connect dots around the world that a lot of other people aren't. And so from an analysis side, a lot of people kind of wonder what it is, what does he really do, right? And if it was super, super spooky and as awesome as the movies and all of that, I wouldn't have my face out publicly. But what it is an extremely unusual, unique skill set and understanding for the world.
Hold on. And because I see the clock, right? And I don't know if you see it on your side, because I don't know what the user experience is on your side, but I see it, and you're stalling. Do you know that? You're stalling. You're like Batman who's about to announce their secret identity and rip off their cowl. Remember on the TV show, the old TV show, and that, like, the Joker would almost be there, or the Riddler or the Penguin, and they would just be right there to take off the cowl, and then something would happen. It's like, holy moly. But you got to take off the cowl unless you don't want to. I'm cool with either way.
To the extent that I'm willing to, I guess. I've been very, very blessed and fortunate in my life to facilitate like the actual heroes, like the actual people who go overseas and do the really dangerous stuff. They can't do to some extent without what people like I do, which is
I'm going to say it. Do you want me to say it? Do you want me to announce your ID? Would that be all right? Is that easier for you?
Yeah, go ahead. It's
okay.
Good.
So by your Twitter handle, you've done you're my only competition for threads. I think, do you know that? You're my only competition for threads. Is you go by man_integrated. Is that right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I think of you as man integrated, but it's actually, your Twitter handle is actually man_integrated. And you've been a lot of people's go-to on actual trade, on actually somebody who's actually doing it, who's booking it, and on logistics, right? Because trade has to move, and you're handling the logistics, you're handling the cargo side. You've got a perspective that's very unique on shipping and how shipping is now moving into the air. And this is your moment to shine, right? So I'm very excited that I got to announce your true ID, because I think it's important, because there's just so much happening in the world, and there's very few people that want to discuss China right now, because there's so much uncertainty in the policy. There's very few people who can reliably discuss air, right? Because people think of passenger air, and then you've said several times that passenger air might be decreasing, but cargo air is through the roof.
Absolutely.
So we've revealed you. You're my competition in threads, and you're also one of everyone's favorite person on Twitter, because you're an expert, and you're one of my favorite people. And we've spoken offline a lot of times, right? Yep.
It's been rewarding to shift into that role. When I got on Twitter, I didn't have a plan, right? It was something of an amusement, of a way to kill time. And I spent a lot of time on the self-improvement type stuff, because that was the things that really fascinated me, that wasn't my day job, right? So to some extent, logistics is both an obsession for me and my day job. And so I spent some time talking about self-improvement, family, what it means to be a man, all these things. And I'm far from a good man. I'm probably better at logistics than I am at being a good human being. But There's still time to work on that too in my life. And where I think, bye.
No, keep going, keep going.
No, I know. So
I had to let my wife in. She just came in. She didn't have the keys.
Tell Nancy hi. So where, as I began to switch back, kind of pivot back into and talking more publicly about the things that I deal with on the day-to-day basis, and that I consult and I do the analysis and I do all these things, I was not ready for the flood of interest into what I consider to be very niche or very weird, topics that maybe people don't, I talk to people in my day-to-day life about what I do, and they're just, you can see it in 5 seconds. They're just.
So let's pick up where we should be picking up, right? Mm-hmm. Because we picked your profile apart now, right? We know your identity, and just like Batman did it all because of like his dad, right? His parents, that was pretty sad, right? And then he became obsessed with the thing and bats, right? Bats because of like whatever. We've picked apart your identity. We know your identity. You love logistics in the same way that my identity is sales. At the end of the day, my identity is sales, and I'm even selling to myself. When I bought Bitcoin after my investor series with Milton, I had to spend 15 minutes talking to myself, literally, to make that investment, because it was such an unusual philosophical jump for me. Isn't that odd? So I want to talk. So Siobhan, thank you so much for being here. And I really like that picture that you chose. That's awesome. I'm not sure what that image is, but it's awesome. If that's you, that's really awesome. I want one of those. So Siobhan Shabria, thank you so much for joining us, who I think is actually new on Twitter, if I recall, because I knew that I was hoping that they would be here. And if I recall, they're kind of new on Twitter. So that's very exciting, because everybody should be on Twitter, right? Everybody should take in the fake news. It's good. It's so Siobhan asks, are you going to talk about supply chains becoming a surrogate for war? Fascinating. Something you said, and it is. So let's kind of begin there, because it really is. And then we'll talk about the current war that's going on, because there is a war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's actually one of the most interesting and insightful questions I've probably ever been asked in any medium. Most of the questions I get asked are, how do I lower my ocean freight rate by $300 a container? So this is a really fascinating, insightful question. And the reason I find it insightful is because it dovetails very neatly with my thesis that what humans can't trade for, they go to war over. That's terrain, that's territory, that's reproductive capacity, making sure there's enough women and men to go around to keep a society alive. And when you get too out of balance, when you trade with everybody, but you're not willing to stand your ground, you're in a situation there where you are going to get walked all over for money. If you're willing to go to war for everything, but you don't want to trade with anybody, then you're going to get crushed. Eventually, you're going to anger enough people or nations that they're going to band up on you, and they're going to grind you into dust. So it's a balance, right? And when you start to see that the world we've moved into very much as a 4th generation warfare paradigm, I think China, and to some extent Russia and a few other countries, understood this before we did, which is that exact question, that supply chain and logistics is a proxy or a surrogate for war. So what was it in the late 90s that Qian Ling, the colonel from the Chinese army, from the PLA, released the book on restricted warfare, basically a huge feature white paper. And one of the things he talks about in that book is that everything is a tool of war if you were willing to look at it correctly, which is very much comes out of a Sun Tzu sort of tradition. And they understood that and adapted that. And, it was in the late, and you and I have talked about this, it was in the late 70s and early 80s when, China set this 50-year roadmap in place and said, we want to become the manufacturing powerhouse of the world for 6 different economic segments, including aerospace, agriculture, Let
me ask you, can I interrupt? Yeah. Can I raise my hand again? Yeah. So in the 90s and in the early 2000s, so I guess the 90s was the Clinton administration, right? Mm-hmm. And then in the 2000s was the Bush administration, neither of which were hard on China whatsoever, right? I mean, they were very liberal with China, but it has its partisan type of thing, so it is what it is. Do you think they had an awareness of the tactical? And I'm not trying to diminish the quality of their elites and the quality of the people that they brought on, because clearly they had experts. But do you think that that war was something that they were really contemplating, that this was a Peloponnesian War of sorts? It's not going to get settled quickly. It's going to be a generational type of thing.
Yeah, I don't think they, and really when I go back and I look at the literature of what the think tanks were putting out then, whether it's MITRE or RAND or any of the others, and really that's where a lot of that stuff bubbles up from, right? It starts at the individual expert level. It becomes sort of the thesis of the think tank or of the group within that, and then they sell those thoughts up into an administration, which, sorry for those of you that think that politicians have a brain in their own head. Most of what they do comes from staff and from think tanks and people in that sort of outer cluster. And so when you go back and you read that literature, I don't think anybody really had any idea. Coming out of the 80s, we still had this this Cold War mentality, right? Which was just build, bigger ships, more ships, bigger planes, more missiles, all these sorts of things, because that was the way we ground the Soviet Union into oblivion. It's a very complex scenario, but when you boil it all down, Reagan's sort of thesis was we can spend them into oblivion. And what we saw is this very canny understanding of how the West operated, both militarily but also economically, which is that we are very much consumer culture driven. And so what China understood, and you can even see that as far back as the 60s, when you look at the way they started to operate, China became nuclear much earlier than people realize.
Well, so let me ask you a question, because I'm rude, right? And as I think I was telling Darren Beatty once, when we did Periscope #2, which was awesome, like the trick you do during dinner, because I've hosted so many dinners and lunches, or even just had regular dinners and lunches, right? Is you ask for the water. Did you know that? That's a trick to do, is you ask for the water and then you go back to it, because that gives you that kind of intermission, right? Isn't that kind of cool? It's yeah, it works. It's so good. So, but I can't, but now I'm going to go like that is, and now I forgot what I was going to say. So it's so interesting, but, so just kind of, where we're jumping to now is, because I really want to get into what's happening now, because you're really the only true leading indicator of what's happening with trade and exchange and kind of who's winning and who's losing. And
Sure.
You're actually seeing the consequences of a failure of policy, perhaps. And I also want to go back to how our relationship began, which was discussing PPE, how there was a bottleneck, and that's part of the war. So in wrapping up the 90s and 2000s, do you think that they felt that, the American companies, American industry felt that they could afford to give away a little bit of an advantage in trade, and they could just kind of recapture their advantage in a decade or so?
Yeah, I think so. You had a truly a profit motive, which was what drove that, right? We made peace, particularly with the McKinseyites and the Bains and the Deloittes and all those guys in the 80s and 90s. That was the MBA model, outsourced to China. It really did boil down to being about that simple. And China understood what we did not understand about ourselves is, if they are willing to offload from us the cost of human capital, the cost of environmental regulations, if they were willing to absorb that, it very much presents to us, with our high consumer demand appetites and our desire to buy bigger, better things cheaper. They understood if they were willing just to take that and to stay silent about it, that they could end up with us becoming completely dependent on them. So we could not have even seen it. We saw cheaper electronics. We saw cheaper cost of goods on things like clothing and furniture and auto parts and all these other things that we begin to offload over to there. And they just stayed silent about it. They took our money, they made the stuff, they shipped it back, and this whole ecosystem grew out where we all thought we were getting this win-win-win-win-win, right? And the whole time what they were doing is they were just taking that money, reinvesting enough of it to keep their economy growing, to continue to build more factories and build more cities and raise the standard of living a little bit. But they were taking a lot of that money and plowing it into black box military projects that we didn't even know about. And so they built this very strong structural foundation of spending, but then they came back underneath it, and with their not reversal, but with their pivot, I guess, in the 90s towards very quiet, unrestricted warfare across all domains, we started to see an expansion of behaviors they'd always engaged in to some extent, which was industrial espionage, corporate espionage.
So let's get to where we are now, right?
Okay.
You see that? Let's get to where we are now, because you and I, our relationship when you were still anon, right, is I think we found each other because I was writing my log of the fastest roll-up of power in history, right?
Right.
And I was trying to chronicle the trade bottlenecks, and I was trying to figure out a mystery, which is what happened to all the swabs, what happened to all the masks, and why was there a bottleneck when there really shouldn't have been a bottleneck, right? I know that China was clearly repurchasing some of the higher quality supply gear. Hey, yeah, cool. Oh, nice. So I understand that they were repurchasing some of the supply gear, but that still wouldn't have been very consequential to let me see if I can. There we go. So now we can see your son, right? That still made a big difference to the bottleneck that was out there, which was really significant. So let's now begin with the war that clearly was pronounced with COVID, right? Now we are in a war of sorts.
Very much so.
Changing, and so let's just start with COVID in January and what you were seeing, and then let's go on to the test, because you were a part of the test also.
So with COVID, there was a lot of debate early on. Was it a biological weapon? Was it something that just sort of organically emerged? And that's really beyond the purview of this. But what we did see emerge from that is very warlike behaviors. Hang on just a second. Tristan, hey, we'll box later. All right, head on upstairs, bud. You can head upstairs. Go on. Love you, buddy. Take the boxing glove with you. Hit your brother with it. That's parenting, I guess. So what we saw when this conflict was announced was a commercial conflict, because it happened right in the middle of, it happened and emerged out of, for the most part, emerged out of Chinese New Year, which came pretty early last year. So we had this very long extended period of time where things that China normally makes, including PPE, they had an advantage, obviously a knowledge advantage, because it emerged there first. So they could see the benefits of PPE. They knew what it needed, and they began stockpiling and hoarding it before any of us even knew that there was really this tidal wave coming that would really shake things up. You can see stories, from as far back as December of 19, January of 20, before the early to mid January timeframe, we began to talk about COVID here. And they were already had syndicates in the US and syndicates in Australia and other countries buying up PPE off the store shelves from medical wholesalers and shipping it all to China. They pretty quickly cornered the market, particularly in things like masks. Gloves is not something that China really had or has the ability to truly corner the market in, mainly because a lot of the gloves are made in places like Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia, because that's where more of the sources of rubber are. Even for the non-latex, like the nitrile type gloves. So they have very large institutionalized manufacturing of gloves, but things like masks, gowns, a lot of the medicines that you need, like ibuprofen and things like that, the whole product or the raw material or precursor products.
So were they withholding product deliberately? I mean, were they kind of doing their own kind of embargo against the US and against the Western world?
Absolutely. I was asked in early February was the first time I was asked to ship something of PPE that was coming from China. And I knew who the factory was. I had dealt with them in the past. So I connected this factory that I dealt with in the past that was a major, major supplier of gloves to a few very, very large group purchasing organizations or medical supply chain companies. So they sold to McKesson, they sold to Owens & Minor, they sold to Premier Health. Huge factory. They churned out hundreds of containers of gloves a month, ocean containers of gloves. You're talking many thousands of boxes. And never in the years I dealt with them had they ever had a capacity shortfall. And then suddenly they were putting people on allocation up to, you can only get 5 containers a month, which was nowhere near meeting the demand that we already started to see exploding.
Was that because of their own kind of indigenous needs of these products? Or was that a surplus? Was there a surplus that they could kind of put on the boats and ship to the Western world? or were they just hoarding these supplies?
I think it's a mix of everything. The problem was certainly far worse in China. I mean, I started hearing stories in late October, early November of 19 in Wuhan. I had some customers in Wuhan. Oh, people are getting sick, and it's just, but that happens every year. It happens every single year that, a type of flu or some weird thing sweeps through a factory, shuts it down for a couple of weeks, slows it down, and then everybody comes back to work and it's all good. That type of stuff is very common in China and in other places, right? I mean, it's common in Vietnam, Thailand, and others. So I didn't pay any mind to it. And
okay, but now we're up to January and February, which is when the FDA and the CDC and kind of America was advising in terms of health policy not to use masks and to use fewer swabs. And part of that was legitimate in that there was a shortage.
Absolutely.
So, I don't think, just from my own kind of critique of these things, there was a legitimate shortage that not everybody could have a mask and not everybody could have a swab. And
there was a shortage here.
Yeah.
There was not a shortage there.
The shortage.
They had available supply. Anything that I needed that I like really begged for bad. And by beg for, I mean, was willing to help negotiate for my clients that they would pay up a lot more. There was a time a case of nitrile non-latex powdered 4 mil gloves sold for $17 a case, $20 a case, maybe if it's really premium stuff that won't break on you. And at the height of, by January and February, that price was creeping up. It was 25, it was 30, it was 40. And what was happening was you had basically an auction market starting to happen.
So what does that mean in terms of if it's $17, because this is it's all Greek to me, right? That's funny. Is what does that mean in terms of how large are like glove purchases usually? I mean, are these typically like $10,000 or $100,000 purchases, or how large is the purchase? How much quantity are they buying?
Without having a calculator in front of me, it would be hard to say, but I can give you some ideas. So, a larger GPO under normal circumstances will import anywhere from 1,500 to 3,000 containers a year, 40-foot, ideally 40-foot high cubes, so you can stack more boxes in there. But we'll import about that many boxes, and each container is going to have anywhere from 3,400 to 4,000 cases of gloves in it. So inside a case of gloves, you're going to have one case is going to be 10 boxes.
And then the consumer for that is who?
That's going to be hospital, food service. It's going to be hospitals. It's going to be doctors, anybody that needs normal PPE.
Is that considered for them kind of a money losing type of product? I mean, it's certainly required in terms of hygiene, but it's not a revenue producer, right? So was the increase in price something that they could absorb, or was it really killing their bottom line, or was there just none available?
You had a pretty serious disconnect, right? But very, very quickly, no. I mean, those guys operate on fractions of cents per glove, per individual glove. It's not quite a loss leading product, but it's certainly one that you make your money on scale, not on a per unit. It's not a premium thing by any means. So very quickly, there was a decoupling that happened of normal supply and demand.
So when you went to when clients were seeking you out for this, right? I'm sure that you already had your business, but they're just looking for everything, right? They're just looking for whatever they can get. So when you were getting the calls, or was it we'll pay whatever it is, or did it just require them to shut down their business?
It probably by March, it came down to we'll pay whatever it takes to land it in the U.S. Because it was already getting extremely expensive to air freight it. We were needing it so fast, everything was going in the air. None of that stuff was coming on water. And so what I was able to work with my clients to do is to build a little bit of push into their supply chain to where we were air freighting everything they needed to land right away. But simultaneous to that, I was telling them, lay the extra hundreds of thousands, or in some cases, many millions of dollars down to buy inventory into June and July and start getting that stuff bought and put on water now too.
So now, and I want to get to a particular instance that I think is really interesting where you were very helpful for me. It's actually part of my log but first let me just understand the FDA as you had explained it to me once before, and I could have misunderstood it, but there were certain requirements on the qualities of the product. So it's not like an American company could just take any product from anywhere. There had to be some type of a quality standard.
Correct. So gloves, certain grades of nitrile gloves are actually considered medical devices because they are being used. So surgical exam gloves that are, nitrile surgical exam gloves, non-powdered, some of them, many of them are actually considered medical devices by the FDA, and they have to be, the cases, everything has to be labeled as such. It has a specific identifier. It has an establishment registration number where the factory itself is, registered with the FDA. And that became super premium because supplies of those needed to be kept for surgery, for when
Okay,
you're performing
so
invasive techniques.
now I want to skip around a little bit because you were very helpful to me, and I want to discuss how you were helpful to me in another front, which is, I wouldn't say kind of it was a hoax, but you helped me. You did forensics, and you're anonymous, right? So you're man integrated, and but you did forensics on. There was big news in March where a doctor who was the head of a medical group said that the government was now interfering in his purchase and acquisition, and he even said that the FBI arrived on the delivery of the goods and confiscated them. And he was not even inferring; he was kind of it was a declamation that they were confiscating them for their own use because there was a shortage. And then you posted a thread. I think I communicated with you right before, but then you posted a thread that did the forensics on that. And I didn't want to bring it up here in terms of all the tweets because I could have actually done that. I have a lot of technology here, man. I'm powerful. But can you, if your memory, and I have a feeling it does, if your memory is good enough, can you kind of roll that back? Because it was around March, and it got a lot of attention as well because you were the only person. Everybody in the world was on that doctor's side, and it was an anti-Trump type of thing. And most people, and certainly a lot of people here, aren't anti-Trump, pro-Trump, anti-Biden. I mean, people just really want to understand beyond kind of the nonsensical, partisan type of stuff. So the doctor made this claim, and then the resistance took that up as to create kind of a panic and then it was amplified on Twitter by inauthentic behavior, which then drove even more people to feel that it now had some authority because of all the volume that the tweets got. So can you do the forensics on that? Do you mind doing a post-mortem on what happened?
Yeah, I mean, it's am I allowed to swear on this? Is this like an R-rated thing or what? Because the word that I
don't curse. Don't curse. It's a family thing, man.
Well, and it involves horse, and so it was really, to me, one of the most obvious and bald-face stories that during that time of people just flat making stuff up or over dramatizing it to such an extent.
Let's begin with what the story was, and then let's do a recap of your forensics on it.
Yeah. So the basic thrust of the story is that a small healthcare practice in like a hospital group in Massachusetts could not lay hands on any PPE through their normal suppliers, the Cardinals and Cardinal Health and McKesson's and those guys. And so they resorted to utilizing some brokers, and that became a huge ecosystem for a while, this broker economy. And they bought from these brokers, and they paid exorbitant sums of money up front to bring in, I believe it was masks was the claim on that, from overseas. And so the basic claim was that the stuff finally landed here, and then Department of Homeland Security got involved, and the FBI got involved, and they had to, land this plane of PPE at some airfield in the middle of nowhere, and then have it, securely, clandestinely trucked to some warehouse in Jersey. And then the FBI showed up to raid it. And then they had to call their congressman to get involved. And then the congressman apparently made some calls to Homeland Security and the FBI, and they released the shipment finally. And so it was this very dramatic Jason Bourne type of narrative.
It was cinematic, and people at that time, it was cinematic, and people at that time actually called him heroic. They called it like Homeric, right? They called him kind of the Homeric beyond any type of reason.
Absolutely, there was
and then you did the forensics on that. So can you help me better understand everything that was misrepresented?
I don't want to be here all night, but so the main misrepresentations were several-fold. That they had done everything completely on the up and up, which they hadn't. B, that Homeland Security and FBI tracked these shipments down to take them, basically to repurpose them. And, the claim was that the shipment was very nearly seized, except for the midnight intervention of their congressman. And that was also not true. The method by which they claimed to have transported into the United States and then through the United States also made no sense whatsoever. So these are things that when you're someone...
No sense, because you discussed how you have to prepay for like the bill of lading or whatever it is, that there's an actual process, that's a very rigid type of sequence that has to go through with. First, I have a good memory. First, they usually send you a sample of the product.
Correct.
For your review, and then you already have to pay for it, and the receipt is very significant. The receipt, whatever your language in this is, because you did like 6 tweets on it. The receipt is something that really is not just a demonstration of proof, but it has to do with the shipment of it, and there are some other logistical parts of it.
Yeah. So the claim that they couldn't prove title to the cargo, which means that they own it, they're responsible for it as the importer of record, was that, well, the broker was the one importing it and they were buying it here on the U.S. side. But what they were describing was an air freight transaction that is what we call DDP, delivered duty paid. So they show their involvement as it didn't jibe, right? So the claim that, well, we didn't ask for samples, we didn't know we were getting, it's totally sight unseen, we were just hoping we were getting the right product. Even at that, I was importing whole airplanes at that time of PPE, of things like gloves and masks. And even then, the factories were still FedExing or sending DHL or UPS samples to the US. Hey, this is the exact thing you're going to get. Allegedly, in a lot of cases it wasn't, but that was the process. And then you stroked a purchase order to them. You paid them immediately. Most factories at that time were doing complete cash up front. So you had to take ownership of the cargo. So if you were doing that, if the broker was doing that on your behalf, you pay the broker pays them, the broker keeps their cut up front for themselves, and then has to also pay for the freight. At the time you pay for the freight, and already by then air freight had become prepaid as well, because everybody needed to get their freight out of China, right? So the airlines were saying, no, we're not offering credit. We're not offering payment on delivery, anything like that. We're telling you it's going to cost $2.5 million to charter the 747. You're going to put $2.5 million in our hands and we'll fly your stuff. And if you don't, somebody else will, and we'll fly their stuff. So that was the situation we found ourselves in. And when you do that, you have a great deal of control. If you're the importer, you have a great deal of control.
Okay. So the doctor got this stuff apparently, and then they claimed that the FBI kind of demanded it, took a claim on it.
Yeah. So what ended up happening was what I suspected at the time to be very true, because I'd already had one incident similar-ish to it on some gloves, was the brokers who were involved in that transaction did not have a history of importing medical product, let alone stuff that was claimed to be genuine article N95 masks, which are medical devices. So because they're used in surgical suites. So because of that, the FBI had an involvement in saying, we suspect that these guys have previously engaged in similar sorts of fraudulent or criminal behavior, and we're watching them. We're going to be involved in this from the backside. The claim that 2 agents just rolled up and threatened to take everything also doesn't make sense. If they were actually coming to raid the shipment, they would have rolled in with a much substantially larger presence of people to manage that if they feared that there was any sort of danger. Homeland Security's claimed involvement also was not in any way did not jibe with anything I'd ever previously dealt with. The involvement of Homeland Security was simply that it could have been anything from these were extremely in-demand, high-value articles where Homeland Security, because they are the agency that controls Customs and Border Protection, also has an oversight role in managing these imports. They would have necessarily been involved. So what I figured out right away, and called a few people that I know in the agencies involved and said, is this probably what's happening here? And they said, yeah, that's absolutely what's happening. It's guaranteed suspicion of fraud on the part of the broker and the importer who is selling it to this hospital. Their involvement was in no way to come take it.
So now the easy story for the media was the doctor is a hero because they really want to celebrate, whatever, right? Mm-hmm. But for the, the explanation that was required is complex. So it's easy for them to say he's a hero because that doesn't really require any interrogation for the most part. When you hear somebody's a hero, there's an assumption that there's a truthfulness to it, maybe an embellishment, but there's a truthfulness to it. But if I were to say he's not a hero, that then kind of demands interrogation, right? That demands kind of an interlocutory.
Absolutely. I mean, I imported, when I added it all up last year, over 30 full aircraft of PPE. Many times more of that in ocean freight for stuff that got put on the water.
Now, there's a lot of questions. There's a lot of questions here. So I want to get to all the questions. And you've been awesome. And hopefully some of the questions will also be about kind of the current status of a war that's going on currently between the U.S. and China. And what you're seeing in terms of freight, who's got the advantage? What are you seeing in terms of the health? Where is product going to? Where isn't it going to? And what happens with the airline industry? So as you do that, I'm going to put this question up from Neonation State. So I want to thank Neonation State very much for being here. I like the image of the robot, and that might be the same image that I recall from somebody who asked me 2 years ago, myself and Scott Adams, what would be a good investment? I said myself and I guess Bitcoin or Boeing. I don't even know because I'm big.
You probably said Boeing. Let's be real.
yeah. If Boeing was around $100, it depends. I think I said Facebook because I'm a big buyer of Facebook also. But Scott might have said Bitcoin. So Neonation State, thank you so much for being here. Says, how much longer will lead times from China get? Same, better ocean freight cost.
Well, I mean, we were just having these discussions with customers today. So to the issue of lead times, that's going to be highly variable based on what you're actually trying to procure and import. Furniture, anything that's high consumer demand items right now, biggest ones being electronics, furniture, to some extent clothes, but for whatever reason, well, home goods as well. But most of us are trapped in our homes. We're looking around and going, I don't like that. I don't like that. I don't like that. And we're spending stimulus bucks or a higher percentage of our disposable income on those creature comforts. We're feathering our nest, so to speak, because we can't go out to eat at restaurants. Now, that is starting to unwind a little bit as states begin to open up. You're going to start to see some of the dollars, I think, flow back into entertainment and hospitality as opposed to home goods and consumer goods. But that's really where a lot of this.
What would be an indication of trade in entertainment? So if entertainment were to improve, is the only way for you to measure that in that the home furnishings would decrease proportionally somewhat?
It's a very strong proxy indicator, if not a direct, if not causal. It's definitely a very strong proxy indicator.
Oh, that's very interesting. So have we satisfied? Because you're the trade expert, so I want to make sure we satisfied that question. How much longer will lead times from China get? Same, better ocean freight cost.
We're going to see a slow ramp up. We just exited Lunar New Year or Chinese New Year. It concluded, basically today, as far as the official dates of it, February 12th to the 19th. But what we're seeing is factories ordinarily would already be starting to come back online middle-ish part of next week on a normal timeline. We're actually going to start seeing them come back in the first week of March. And the reason for that is these people are coming back from the interior of China. And for a lot of people who don't know our industry, most of the people who work at the factories and things like that actually aren't native residents of Shanghai or Qingdao or Tianjin or Dalian or Xiamen or wherever. They actually are from, the interior provinces of China, and then they migrate out, and then twice a year, basically, they're able to go home.
So is that an indication of the health of the Chinese economy, that it's going to be pushed out an additional week or an additional 2 weeks? Does that mean that there's less demand, or does that mean
it's a function of quarantining? It's a soft quarantine sort of deal. I mean, we all know the situation with COVID in China is worse than they've ever let on. That's just an article of faith at this point. What's happening is to basically prevent the spread of COVID coming back into the cities, coming back into the factories. Tianjin's already completely shut down. It's effectively blockaded. Very difficult for trucks to get in and out with goods. The port's very slow there and congested right now.
I'll tell you something interesting. You're the best China expert in your own way, and you may not even realize it, because I'm an expert I'm definitely one of the top specialists on certain finance and going through the opaqueness of their loans, and doing a lot of forensics on that. It's a big part of my family office and our research, and then taking positions that have been very bearish on China, and they've all worked out, taking physical inventories and a lot of things too. But all the different specialists that are out there in their own kind of category can't really comment on the status of China right now, because everything is unknown. And there's been, and you and I were discussing this right before, there's been almost a negligence on Biden's part, on Biden's administration, to kind of give any forward. We're not even seeing the language of diplomacy that can give people an indication of what happens next. So, right. So you're the go-to guy right now. So I want to skip on. Chuck, thank you so much for being here. Chuck and I did a Periscope with Alan Bukhari, massive views. I think we had like 50,000 lives, and he's awesome. So Chuck says, interested in hearing your comments on Dubai, United Arab Emirates as a transshipment political point.
Awesome. Before I forget, I will finish the previous question here. Biggest reason, so the lead times are extended for now. The factories are going to stay choked probably till the middle of the year. Ocean freight rates right now are sitting around the $6,000 to the West Coast point. If you're paying premium, if you're just trying to get on the ship and not pay over, you're in the 4,500 to 5,000 range. We're going to see a retracement from that. Fixed contract rates are going out right now in the 3 to 4 range for the West Coast. Low 4s to 4.
Tell me what that means, because that's kind of the internal jargon. I don't understand it.
Thousands of dollars per 40-foot container.
So what does that mean in terms of what the future looks like from you? I mean, as a leading indicator, what does that mean? Does that mean good times ahead, and for who? And who's kind of winning? If you were to kind of make this a battle line, what does it mean going forward?
So what we're going to see, at least through the middle of the year with regards to China freight, is going to be really two sort of trends. Congestion is going to absolutely continue. The demand is going to continue for a while. And so the congestion will continue to that point.
The demand is in what products? What product families?
Right now, still in the furnishings, home goods, electronics. As we start to get into spring, you're going to start to see a shift towards like outdoor toys, and a lot of that stuff is made in China as well.
How about in terms of phones, and how about in terms of phone, parts like glass, and how about also in terms of like heavy technology equipment, because that's the high margin stuff. I mean, making mattresses is the internals, and it's a bad business, right?
Absolutely. I mean, we saw the issue as far as high margin electronics with PlayStation 5s. Sony was able to land prior to launch day only about 8% of the volume they needed to hit their sales targets by the end of the year. They're still not even at 50% as far as like landing of actual product in the US. Absolute disaster for them. And it's not really their fault. They couldn't have planned that far ahead. But it is in terms of inventory. I mean, Twitter was just full of angry people. So coming into this year, we're going to start to see things that are big, things that are heavy, things that take a long time to manufacture, like heavy equipment. The lead times on that's going to continue to be long, continue to be expensive. The factories are going to continue to want people to pay more or all up front, as opposed to, say, half up front, half.
Is this an indication of a health of an economy, or not a health of an economy?
I would say it's an indication of their fragility right now.
Okay, so we're going to skip on. So Chuck asked again, interested in also hearing your comments on Dubai, United Arab Emirates, and a transshipment political point. And keep in mind, we're going into the speed round, not the fast speed round and not the faster speed round, but we're going into like that speed round. So we haven't ordered dessert yet, but we just finished our main course.
I like it. It's a great question. I'm actually very bullish on UAE in a lot of ways, but particularly from a logistics perspective. The Middle East for a long time has not really enjoyed like a stable transshipment hub. Trans-Pacific and what you would call the Eurasian trade route never really needed a hub there in the Middle East. But what we're seeing with the emergence of India is now exporting a lot more product than it used to, which I'm all for that. They do a fantastic job. But we're starting to see a density of freight now begin to sort of agglomerate in the Indian Ocean region. Whereas before it was very much driven by what's being produced in Europe, what's being produced in Asia, and how much demand Europe and the US have for those sorts of products. Now with India and these other growing economies that are not just purely energy driven, which is sort of what the Middle East had been for a long time, they're becoming manufacturing hubs as well. So you're starting to see Dubai in particular really emerge as a transshipment hub for a couple of reasons. It's very, very well located for everybody, right? They've charted that middle course politically and said we'll engage with anybody on the basis of trade, kind of going back to my thesis of trade versus conflict. So they are emerging somewhat as a political power in the region. They're definitely evolving themselves more as a regional player like KSA and Israel have. But to that extent, you're still seeing a very liberal trade policies and logistics policies that are very inviting. They have huge free trade zone capabilities in Dubai, an extremely robust capability and infrastructure for air freight. Jebel Ali, the main port there, has become a really extraordinary transship hub for the region. Very, very, very important stabilizing role that UAE is playing. But you're also seeing UAE continue to grow as a finance and technology hub. You're continuing to see some of what's being lost by London, New York, and Hong Kong, particularly Hong Kong, with a lot of the issues there. It feels like a lot of that's sort of moving to Dubai and moving to the UAE. The standard of living continues to grow there. Of course, there's issues underneath the surface, but I think for the coming 15 to 20 years, 30 years, I think you're going to see the UAE continue to emerge as an extremely important pivot point in kind of the bipolar world we're moving into with the US and China's spheres of influence.
That was awesome. So that I got to tell you something. I like you a lot better as Ross Kennedy than I do as Man Integrated, because you know a lot, man. The problem with Twitter is you're kind of confined, and the use of languages can't really be too elegant or even exquisite. And I got to tell you, you are awesome. I listen to all these right after I'm done with it. I have my M&Ms and I listen to them. You are awesome. So there's a lot of questions here. So I want to get on to the questions. So here, RK, who first said Man Integrated for National Quartermaster, right? And now says, now asks, so thank you so much for being here. How do we restore what we have lost? I see companies leaving China but not manufacturing in the United States.
I think fundamentally, the most fundamental aspect of this is we have to recalibrate our consumer spending habits. Consumer spending habits fundamentally was the lever that China was able to use against the United States and continues to with all of this purchasing that we're doing of various things. We need to recalibrate what we think of as our standard of living. Now, this is not some argument for the Great Reset and we need to all go live in hovels in the woods and things like that. But we need to accept that first, there is a trade-off that we have allowed to happen for the last 40 years, where China began to emerge in the early to mid to late 80s, and it's really started to climb as a manufacturing power. Going back to what I said at the beginning, they were able to do that by saying, you know what, US and you know what, Europe, with your high standards of living and your consumer demand that's just seemingly endless, we'll make your stuff for you cheap. And we're not going to tell you about the cost in human life. We're not going to tell you about the technology and data that we're stealing and trade secrets that we're stealing.
How do we bring that back do you see that just in terms of the density of the supply chains, right?
Mhm.
Nobody has the density of China, right? We already know that. India certainly doesn't have the density of China. Malaysia, Vietnam don't, and they don't have the human resource. They don't have the human capital yet, that's trained on some of this type of stuff that we're seeing in Vietnam, which is why I expect China to have a war with Vietnam, although other people expect it to be Taiwan. So how do we, can this be, do you see the alternative reshoring this stuff? Does America have the density of supply chains to even service the United States?
No. We have two really large fundamental weaknesses. One is that we have a very distributed country as far as our population centers, where the only way to make that work is to co-locate manufacturing, because our domestic, believe it or not, our domestic freight network is extremely choked, and it's only getting worse. Railroads are getting more congested. The highways are getting more congested. We have a manpower crisis in the trucking industry. The railroads are starting to consolidate down and begin to raise their rates to a point where before it was very economically efficient to manufacture something in, say, Dallas that is largely consumed, say, in New York, because you could get it there fairly expensively. Those days are pretty much gone. So we don't have
fairly inexpensively. Did you mean fairly expensively or fairly inexpensively?
Used to be inexpensively.
Yeah, because I think you had inadvertently said expensively. So does America, this is because we're getting into the speed round now, because this is such an important question. There's a lot of questions here. Does America have the density in the supply chain to be able to ship to America the same way even as China can ship to America? Do we have the density of the supply chain?
No, we don't. We're going to have to bring that back. If we want to bring it back closer to our shores and more under our sphere of control, then we need to have a very ethical and open and honest conversation with other countries in our sphere of influence, particularly Mexico, Central America, certain economies in South America. We need to be able to, where the labor cost is lower, maybe the infrastructure is present to be able to do it, but it has to be an ethical conversation. It has to start there first, because we looked the other way for 40 years while China put that cost on their laborers and their people, lower wages and health issues and all of that. We can't do that again. So if we're going to try to reshore, we need to embrace reshoring, I think, as the very, very critical things are medical supply chain, our very high technology supply chain, things like semiconductor foundries, defensive products, defensive articles. Those we can bring back to the U.S. We do have the skilled labor. We do have the manpower. We do have the knowledge. We do have the infrastructure for that. Cheap consumer goods, things like couches, things like TVs, that sort of stuff. If we want to reap to some extent the economic and cost advantages that we currently enjoy in the model that we have with China, then we're going to have to basically offload that cost onto somebody else again and pay more so that we're not charged with that same ethical challenge.
So if I have goods in the middle of the country, I actually went in, I was a big part of, although I shouldn't say it, but now that there's a new administration, of the discussions with Foxconn, which I kind of knew was happening even before Biden came in. And I want to be fair. If Hillary had come in, there would have been the same type of move because of the vulnerabilities of supply chains and kind of the risks. These are long-term contracts and it gets boring. But, Trump was clearly the much greater advocate for it, right? He brought it to the public's attention and got public support for it much better than anybody else ever could have done. I have to give credit. So here's a question. If something is produced in the middle of America, how does it get out and kind of radiate out when we don't have the electrical grid, we don't have the energy grid, we don't have the travel? So somebody here asks, it's an interesting question. Rip Dizzle, thank you so much for being here. Rip Dizzle 1 says, will air include blimps?
I think it's viable for certain point to point. Blimps, you are giving up a lot of the advantage. Now you are still able to cover more distance in an airship, like a powered airship, because you're bending the geography of the earth to your will, which is the advantage of air freight. That's how you can fly somewhere at 400 miles an hour, but you can cover that 400 miles an hour covers a lot more that in the air than distance on the ground because of, simple geometry of the earth. So airships will enjoy that same advantage. They're also not extremely expensive, at least so far as I know, to produce versus a 737. What you do get into with airships is you get a bit of a safety issue. You also don't have the ability to carry quite as much. There's not a heavily, a Ford jet 747 can carry a lot.
We're going to move on. That was awesome. You just know so much. Very interesting question. And this was a question that was also posed to Dennis Wingo that might join us, right? I just invited him into the back because we're going to talk about Space Force in a moment.
Nice.
But I know I'm so excited and you're an expert on it. So we're going to get to these questions. So Sir Mix-a-Lot, and I like that picture, says, what skills are most needed for a career in logistics?
You have to have a lot of humility about what you do for a living. For one, logistics, you are going to be almost always the overlooked person. That's why I was so surprised people cared about anything I had to say related to logistics. But it's a very unsung career. You are the one that is.
I'm going to interrupt for a second. You want to hear something? So when I was doing my log, this part of it, there were a lot of reports from McKinsey. I'm sure you read the same reports. There were a lot of reports coming from the big shops that they were rating everything on a scale. And they said logistics is the easiest part of the whole equation. Did you ever see that report? Did you ever see that report? They were like, logistics is
No, because I 100% would have written a 50 tweet long thread about why that's dumb.
But so what skills are needed? What particular skills, going past the emotional kind of reservoir, what skills are most needed for a career in logistics? What are the skills? Let's not even talk about high school or college because those things are kind of stupid, right? But what skills are actually needed for a career in logistics?
Number one is a capacity for understanding human beings, especially systems thinking. I talked a little bit about that earlier. Because you have to have a ironclad mental model, or ideally an ecosystem of mental models that you can sort of phase shift between, depending on what problem and solution set you're working towards. So, highly recommend.
What are the skills? Tell me if you're a kid or you're 20 or 30 years old, what should you be reading?
You should be trying to solve puzzles, all kinds of puzzles, not just putting pieces here and there. Any sort of puzzle. Play puzzle games.
How about in terms of math? What math skills are needed? What books? So I went to Wall Street and I dropped out of school because I knew school was not right for me. I wanted to go straight to Wall Street. I wanted to be ahead of everybody. I literally thought by the time I have a career on Wall Street, these people are just going to be getting out of school and looking for internships. And they were, because they came to me, right? So what's the shortcut? What should they be reading? So I spent my entire time in business libraries reading, getting an asymmetrical advantage, the same way kids today are inquiring about Bitcoin and getting an asymmetrical advantage. What should a kid be reading in a business library?
Weights and measures, volumetric stuff. Everything that we do in logistics is driven around the trade-off between capacity of a given mode of transportation and the cost to move it. So one of my biggest competitive advantages, it's one I learned because agriculture and commodities trading in particular is extreme. You have to become very fluent. You have to be very dense with knowledge on all the different units of measure. And I got to a point at one time where, just completely off the top of my head, I was converting millions of units of bushels to metric tons, to short tons, to stones, to pounds, to all these things. And so being able to very fluently move weights and measures in and out of the different units and understand the correlation is an extremely powerful competitive advantage, because you are fundamentally limited by the trade-off between capacity of a mode of transportation and the cost to do something. So being able to fluidly move between all of those is how I can tell you faster than most people if it is a good idea to move something via air freight versus ocean freight to achieve a certain project goal.
No, just give me the skills. I just want to know what books, where I should be focusing. It's important, but let's just, if you've got a 20-year-old kid in front of you, and they just want 2 sentences, what are those 2 sentences?
Merchants of Grain would be the first book I would start with. That's the fundamental text. And there's a book called 90% of Everything. And the author escapes me off the top of my head.
And really quickly, who wrote Merchants of Grain? What's it about?
I'm forgetting the authors off the top of my head. I'm on the spot, man.
I know. Good. That's the whole.
Merchants of Grain. Merchants of Grain came out in the 70s. It was a story of the development of mega agriculture conglomerates Cargill, ADM, Conti, and Louis Dreyfus.
And so that's kind of like the book that's kind of like an alma mater for somebody that wants to kind of reroute themselves around formalized education to acquire that.
Absolutely.
Okay, so
absolutely,
now
because it teaches you how humans eat, how we buy and sell the things that we need, and importantly, how those things are moved.
So we're going to continue going on, and it's a philosophical question, right? It's a political science question as well. So Rising Serpent, again, thank you so much for being here, says, why is Bill Gates acquiring so much farmland? And let's not speculate too much into his mind, but we know it's kind of evil a little bit, right? So why is Bill Gates acquiring so much farmland, and how does it dovetail into the supply chain?
I don't see it necessarily as a nefarious thing so much as it's an extremely wealthy individual understanding a specific key trend. Farmland has pretty much always been a good investment to some extent or another. But
in terms of the supply chain.
Yeah, sure. So humans fundamentally need three things. We need food, we need water, we need energy, right? Everything else in our world that we inhabit revolves around those three things. When you control the supply, you can corner the supply of a commodity for a time. You can either do it on paper or in the markets, or you can do it for real. But these are fundamentally physically perishable commodities that they either spoil or they get consumed. So you don't necessarily acquire all the power in the world by owning the supply. What you do is you own the means of production, and the most fundamental means of production, the most important thing to a human being is food. And the most important thing to making food is the ground it comes out of. It's either the food you eat, which is plants and vegetables and grains, or it's the food that your food eats if you're a meat eater, which is plants and vegetables and grains. We can only synthetic so many things, but even then we talk about synthetic meat, vegan this, vegan that, whatever it may be. That stuff is still made at some level from food.
Okay,
from plants.
We're going to go on for just a moment, and I want you to continue answering that question as we go on to the next part of it, which we might have Dennis Bingo join us in a few seconds, because we're going to talk about Space Force and we're going to talk about logistics and Amazon. So actually, I'm going to hold on to that question for a little bit. And
okay.
Toy Biederman, thank you so much for being here. Says, I agree. So John Doe says, it was very much seen and known by Kissinger and Brzezinski, and indeed the plan. I mean, who do you think trained Mao? I've heard that before, and we can't really think about it too much right now. But they were definitely aligned with the diplomacy was definitely shared between them. Supply chain issues is how Mike Cernovich got wind of COVID very early.
Yep. It was also why I was making jokes at the end, middle to end of January about why don't we call this disease Captain Trips? I suspected already by then we were looking at a biologically developed type of thing that just kind of escaped, obviously a reference to the Stephen King book, The Stand. The only way we could have probably known exactly what was going on, or at least been able to measure the severity and threat of it, was on the supply chain side. Because the U.S. is so intimately tied to the Far East, and because that was the origin of the outbreak, any disruption there that's a non-seasonal disruption to the pattern means that there's probably a bigger indicator. Like I said, I started hearing about these things in the factories in October and November, but completely ignored them and wrote them off as the normal sort of seasonal things that we see there with people getting sick. By December, it was getting a little weird. By January, I still didn't know what was really going on, but people were getting sick and supply chains were being disrupted. I didn't panic about it because I'm not a panicky person. But definitely at that point was should have sounded the alarm maybe a lot louder than I did, but I kind of wrote it off. It's and I shouldn't have done that. That was a huge, I would say, tactical error on my part, maybe not realizing how big the problem was going to get so fast.
Yeah, very interesting. And I know there was other kind of indicators. There was like a flu analysis site, and I don't want to get lost too much in it because I'm an expert, and I'll just talk myself blue and just blue. Here our case is understand supply chains, understand how the world works. Yesterday, I did an investor series with Tracy Schuchard, and we discussed energy. And I so much agree with you that it's food and energy, right? What was your other? I know food and energy.
Water.
And what?
Water.
border, yeah. And I don't think people really appreciate how much how much the underdeveloped world is becoming developed, and they are just squeezing, dude. The demand is just going through the roof. So Static Lullaby One, thank you so much for being here. Says, does the U.S. own any container company? Does the military ship using their own containers?
Oh, so this is a extremely deep question, and one, Adam, you probably see me digging into a lot with some of the naval side of Twitter with the maritime, the military sea lift command and all that. So the short answer is that yes, the U.S. does have some smaller, more bespoke or niche type carriers that service our intercoastal waters with various territories, Hawaii, Guam, Puerto Rico, the Caribbean, that kind of thing. They all operate under what's called the Jones Act. Jones Act is essentially a sort of protectionist law or paradigm that requires that any vessels that are going to conduct trade within the territorial waters of the United States needs to be U.S. flagged and U.S. manufactured. So the last major ocean carrier that we would say Maersk or CMA or MSC or COSCO are the ones people kind of broadly know, was APL. And APL sold off in the 90s to Neptune Orient Lines, which is a Singapore-based company. The industries continue to consolidate down. APL, American President Lines, all their ships were named after presidents, right? They now are owned by CMA CGM, which is a French company. And it now as far as very large top 15, top 20 type global carriers, the U.S. does not have any indigenous lines. Our biggest ones are Matson and Crowley. Crowley tends to dominate the Gulf and the eastern seaboard and into the Caribbean.
Does that threaten us in the same way? And we were discussing this yesterday with Tracy, in fact, Tracy Sushard. Does that threaten us in terms of right now China, they only have two threats against us, right? They've got two significant threats that are immediate. One of them is minerals and mining, right? The output of minerals and mining, precious metals. And the other is API and the ingredients for pharmaceuticals, right? That's their two choke points. Does France having that large shipping line, is that a potential choke point?
It is for us to the extent that we can find ways to cooperate. I mean, CMA CGM somewhat offers as most of the mega carriers, and this is the dirty secret. It's not a secret to people like you and I, but it is a secret to most people. The vast majority of the world's freight, containerized freight at least, moves on ships that are basically de facto or outright state-owned enterprises. France, CMA CGM is such a massive company and so important to the French that it's an extension of government policy. Same for Maersk in Denmark. Same for MSC, which is actually owned by a family of Italians, but is domiciled in Geneva, Switzerland. Hapag-Lloyd is an instrument of German policy. COSCO, very much an instrument, very influential in the civil military fusion domain for China. Okay. So us not having that is very much a weakness for us.
Interesting. So we're going to continue on because there's a lot of questions. And Dennis Wingo, he's trying to make his way into the green room, right? He's having technological difficulties. We're going to talk about Space Force in a moment. So Dullah Bhatti 2021, and I'm not sure what that image is. So let me know what that is.
It looks like Genghis Khan.
Does it? Genghis Khan is awesome. I was actually just reading about Genghis. So our country's moving their supply chains from China significantly.
No. There's been a shift for sure. You're seeing more pharmaceutical manufacturing move to India, which I'm all for that. Certainly would rather see them have some level of control over the precursors and the final product. You're starting to see a lot of the home goods and consumer goods type things move to tire production is another one that's moving out because we've slapped them with so many duties and tariffs and things like that that it's now cheaper in some ways for Cooper Tire or Goodyear to make their tires here in the U.S. than in Thailand, Vietnam, or in China. But so you are starting to see through some measure of people reshoring from China, or the cost of goods has gotten and regulatory burden has gotten so high. But the interesting thing is a lot of these companies that say, well, we're moving our manufacturing operations from China they're physically leaving the territory of China, and that they're moving to Vietnam or Thailand or Malaysia or Indonesia or whatever it may be, but they're still owned by the same Chinese stakeholders. They're still beholden to some extent to the masters that they have back in China, the stakeholders that they have there, whether it's CCP, PLA, the mega capitalists. So the trust that I have that these companies are, they're leaving the territory of China, but they're not leaving the span of control or the geopolitical desires of China. You're really only seeing that for the companies that are, there's a few that are offshoring into Taiwan, for example. They obviously have a very vested interest in breaking free of the Chinese influence. You're seeing a lot of stuff come back to Mexico, which is fantastic. You're even seeing some companies begin to set up in places in the Middle East or in Africa, where the natural resources are present.
We're going to skip on, and thank you so much for that. Yeah, it went like that again, right? So I'm very interested in this. So Kira RK, again, thank you. And I think up north a little bit on the comments, you're also in supply chain industry, so that's awesome. So it shows. So there's a Berry Amendment extended for medical tech pharma. What does that mean?
I don't want to speak intelligently to it. I actually that's news to me. I think Kira's got me stumped here.
Oh, that's awesome. Look, you guys are down. That's awesome. So I know. So that's the whole thing about.
But I will look into it and get an answer back. How's that?
Yeah, that's awesome. So Shivan Chabria, thank you again for joining us, and I just love that image. Says, what are the chances that U.S. achieves a semblance of supply chain independence, and do you feel there's any political will? And you actually, we were discussing me making an introduction into the Trump White House, I recall, because you had felt that there really wasn't a coherent strategy.
There never was. There never was, because it's such a complex issue that also requires, and the second part of the question I think is more important and germane than anything else to the first question. There isn't a political will. Our entire economy, to some extent, is built on spending. It's built on consumption. And so the politicians all have portfolios. They all have constituents. They all have people that they need to keep happy. But fundamentally, the thing that makes people the most unhappy is that feeling of insecurity. Food insecurity, energy, and water insecurity being the big three. But anytime there's a perceived fallback in the standard of living, my TV is now too expensive to buy, my car is too expensive to buy, people get, the chickens start to get restless and the politicians get nervous. So there is very much the political and power incentives are weighted towards any solution that keeps things as inexpensive as possible for people to continue to feed their habits. So the political will, even tying it to a national security threat, and it's a huge national security threat for us to not be able to make our own stuff. We're just now seeing the articles coming out, which I've been screaming about and standing on my head and yelling about for years now, about China's pretty much heckler's veto over most of the critical materials that our defense industry requires. Everything from iridium to various grades of rare earth. It's a national security threat, and we don't have the political will to deal with that. So I don't think we reach supply chain independence anytime in my lifetime, unless we have a complete and total systemic collapse in consumer buying power.
Do you know, I actually took a physical inventory in some of the metals. When I went down to Bolivia, I've got stories to tell about this. It's really interesting because they can flood the market and just dump prices.
Yes, they can.
They've got strategies in metals and minerals and mining that America doesn't have, because our companies have to be profitable while they have their form of capitalism is the state-owned enterprises stealing from the Chinese Communist Party. It's a very different people operating system. So Living Logos, thank you so much for being here. I was on his Periscope several months ago, and from what I understand, Ross, you did a discussion with him that's still secret. So Living Logos says, any manufacturing gaps created by turbulence in China manufacturing, which could be filled domestically.
Certain ones, auto parts would be a big one. If not domestically, we at least need to take a look at what the North American manufacturing base looks like as opposed to just the U.S. Because Mexico really has modernized its manufacturing capabilities in the last 20 years, again, driven by consumer demand for different products. So there is an infrastructure, there is capability, and then it's obviously far more local to us. So I support as much as possible whatever manufacturing we can bring back to North America, not just the U.S. Those ties, I think, will deepen. As far as the things, medical is one we absolutely could bring back if we solve the precursor chemical issue, which I think is resolvable. But that does require a significant amount of political will, and I believe will require a pretty substantial amount of subsidization by the federal government. Japan was able to begin to rip back some of their supply chain from the dependence they begin to develop. Korea doing the same thing. I guess South Korea, if people want to be pedantic, but they were only able to do it by going all in on subsidies. And normally, I'm not a subsidy guy. Normally, I'm a let the free market decide. But I think we're also past the point of lying to ourselves that the U.S. is a fully transparent, open, and free market, as maybe Milton Friedman would have understood it. We have achieved far more of a corptocracy than anything, and so because of that,
gotcha.
The issues of subsidies has to make sense.
See how I just ordered water? See that? Water. I asked the waiter to be kind and give us some water. So Dollar Bata 2021, and I'm going to discuss this as well, but I'm going to give it to you first. Is Gwadar Port what China and Pakistan, is it what they're expecting, what they're hoping it to be, or is it a failure? And let me first discuss that, because I'm not sure if you're familiar.
Boy, this is so far in your wheelhouse, Adam. Oh my goodness.
It is, I know, and I'm going to skip kind of the origin story about its purchase from the Sultanate of Omar, which was really a very good deal for Pakistan. However, it's becoming priceless for China. So just in terms of its geography, it's about 45 miles away from the Iran border and from the Gulf of Oman. So it's at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. And it's very close to what's it called? The Straits of Hormuz, right? That's what it is. The Strait of
the Strait of Hormuz. Yep.
Yeah, which right now is it's the only sea passage from the Persian Gulf to the ocean, and right now it's where all the oil goes through. So the Gwadar part is going to become very significant, and what China needs it because it allows them to unload petroleum, and we were discussing energy yesterday with Tracy. So it allows them to unload petroleum from the Gulf countries, and then transport them through China itself, through through the provinces in the northwest China. So right now everything is going through the Straits of Malacca, right? Which is where all those pirates are. When you hear of pirates,
huge choke point. In my opinion, the biggest in the world.
Yeah, so the current transit route is through the Straits of Malacca, and the main shipping channel is between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, right? Which is obvious, I guess. And that's 30% of the world's trade, seaborne trade, which is what you deal with. And so the Gwadar port, it reduces the distance from Asia, from I guess the West Asia, right? From West Asia to China. And it moves away from the pirates and all the vulnerabilities of the bottleneck of the Malacca Straits, which you said is a national concern. And it cuts the time, and it cuts the thousands of miles, and it's a big part of the CPEC, which is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. However, there's a lot of big problems with it, which is number one, it's the Balochistan separatists, which keep on causing disruption in the Gwadar port. Gwadar port is Balochistan kind of territory, emotional and lineage territory. And as such, it's also where they do all of their fishing. So it's also a place where the locals actually fish. So it's not just a political, and it's not just a lineage in terms of the morale of the Balochistan people, but they also want some revenue. Right now, it's been there's a 99-year lease to China, and they want a significant part of the revenue. And there have been hundreds of people. I think, off the top of my head, there was the Balochistan separatists went into a large hotel several years ago, and if I recall, killed at least 100 people. It was probably significantly more, but that's what I recall. So the thought is that as the supply chains are changing, the Gwadar port is going to become significant. Right now, the preference of the ports are in Afghanistan, and that's going to change to the Gwadar port. So with all that said, I said so much about it. That was my response. I think it's going to be a failure for several years more, and that's because there's so much corruption in Pakistan, and it's unfortunate we all wanted Khan to clean it up against the generals, but we have to deal with reality. There's just so much corruption there. And one of the things that one of the consequences of the corruption is we're not seeing those special economic zones properly funded. Initially, the agreement was that China would pre-fund these things so that Pakistan, which is already very cash short, could begin and continue with development and order the inventory of goods that were required to heavy machinery and earth-moving equipment. But there was so much corruption and so much pilfering of it that now China refuses to pre-fund these things and will only fund after the projects have already begun, which it just puts everything at a standstill. So that's my answer. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think Guadar is a interesting case of being both an abysmal failure, but also serving an extremely important purpose. And that is that it does give China an outpost all around, as you correctly noted, where you look at where Guadar is, it is very much part of China's string of pearls approach to port acquisition, because it serves as a very valuable refueling and logistics and supply chain hub before, in the event there is any conflict inside the Persian Arabian Gulf.
I'm going to add to that. I'll tell everyone one of my big concerns with the Biden administration, and I want to be very respectful because we haven't seen a lot of policy. We've seen no policy coming out of them yet, and this is really critical policy. So, is Djibouti is between the Guadar port and Djibouti would be the two greatest marine expedition forces in the world. They really want to put at least 50,000 of their PLA Navy Marine onto Djibouti, and Djibouti is their revenue is they're in real peril because they're so economically vulnerable to the Exim Bank. So you're very right to note that Guadar Port has more implications than just trade. It's also where the Marines are going to jump off of and conquer the world if they can.
There's also a large submarine manufacturing facility that could be used as a replenishment or new build facility. They're already licensing some of the Chinese designs for manufacture there. So because Pakistan ultimately wants to, they see heavy industrial manufacturing and defense articles as a way up economically, the way Turkey very much has done that. So you've got Guadar where, for right now, is it the major container hub it was supposed to be? No, and it probably never is going to rip that away from Karachi. Karachi is already very established. There's tons of multinational entities that have port and terminal and shipping operations there. So Guadar, if you think of it more as what it is, which is a logistics and supply chain enabler for both civil and military applications, I still think it has a chance of being successful in the paradigm that maybe Pakistan and China think it will. But it's in a lonely part of the world, man. And the United States, because of our blue water naval capabilities, we would very easily be able to degrade and disrupt it in that role as a military hub if it ever came to it.
Interesting. That was really interesting. So thank you for that addition to my tirade. Right. So Javon, thank you so much for being here. And
love Javon Brown. He's awesome.
He is awesome. And I recall the early days of Culture with him and Ali Alexander, and he is definitely awesome. So Javon, thank you so much for being here. Ask, can you discuss the semiconductor supply issue? How serious is it? And then he says, thanks for this, Adam and Man Integrated and Javon. In case you weren't here for it, his name is Ross Kennedy. We've unmasked Batman. So again, Javon says, can you discuss the semiconductor supply issue? How serious is it?
It's pretty severe, right? So Taiwan has really enjoyed an advantage. So one thing people don't understand, and it's very simple and arcane at the same time, is the semiconductor industry is really it's bifurcated. So what we think of as semiconductor manufacturers often aren't. Often what they are is almost their research, their design. They even do some secondary fabrication, but the real meat and potatoes of where semiconductors are manufactured is the foundries. And the vast majority of the foundries in the world are located in Taiwan and China and a couple of other places that are not inside the U.S.'s direct span of control. The semiconductor issue is one reason we very much care about Taiwan, as well as some of our legacy support. So that problem, when you have so much importance vested into relatively few entities, any disruption at that level fired a factory like we just had with one of the major manufacturers. When you have that, there's no surplus capacity in the market that can just kick on, like in the event of tires, right? Well, if a tire factory goes up in flames, A, it's going to be a fire that's going to burn for 20 years, but B, there is additional surplus capacity for manufacturing in the market that we can start to substitute some of these things. That's not so with these foundries. There's not very many of them, and they are so critical. So they become very fragile. The world economy becomes fragile. Anything that relies on semiconductors, which is almost everything anymore. Where China has taken a twofold approach that I think was tactically brilliant, if certainly worrisome, given what side of the fence I live on, is they attacked raw materials and foundries at the same level. They made it very important for research, R&D, by utilizing all of the trade secrets, let's be honest, the technical data they've stolen from all these companies over the years. They've been able to reverse engineer or indigenously develop their own capacity for manufacturing. Where it gets really worrisome, though, is that they took the forward view 20 years ago and said, what are some of the leading and bleeding edge materials that could become very, very, very important in the digital economy to the fabrication of these things? Silicon is always something that we've used as the primary material. It's cheap to produce. It's got a very wide range of uses. It's extremely adaptable. But there are better materials out there. They can carry more load. They don't melt at as high a temperature. They don't melt at higher temperatures. They don't stop working at lower. China's cornering the market on those materials.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Things like gallium.
And we've discussed Taiwan considerably here. And I also want to note that I have family there. And as well as, if I recall, Chuck, who hopefully is still with us, has family from Taiwan as well. So I think Taiwan is really an issue. And I did an investor series with Nitin Gokal, and from India, who's one of he's an expert on defense, and he feels that Taiwan is extremely military vulnerable. That's going to be the first act of belligerence from China. So the next question is from JB Lessons. So thank you so much for joining us, JB Lessons. And I see you're coming from YouTube, so thank you very much. I'm going to answer the first part of this, which is, did the panic around Trump's tariffs manifest into reality? And I've written a lot about this, so I wouldn't even know where to begin, other than to say that there was never really a genuine concern about it. In many, many ways, America is already one of the cheapest countries that imposes the fewest tariffs and the lowest tariffs in the world. And in fact, there's an extortion that I have to be fair to India. India is one of the highest, and it's something that I think the relationship between Trump and Modi was resolving. So I would say that one of the losses that we've seen there is from that. And I've written a lot about this because everybody knows I'm very pro India. I live there part time, and I want the relationship to continue as strong as it is. But I will say that the purpose of tariffs is not to make the product more expensive for consumers, and it's to change the economics of the companies that are currently offshoring, and to resolve the unfair practices that are occurring overseas in the tariffs. So I think most of the analysis that I saw was looking at the auto industry, and the auto industry just goes wherever it can find cheap labor to arbitrage.
That's exactly right.
And wherever it can find the most lax environmental laws and all the other ways that they can, get profits. So a lot of it will go through Mexico, and a lot of it will go through China. So, we really didn't see any of the panic that was anticipated to occur, and any of the pricing that was occurred. What I was hoping, and let me include within this that I know Peter Navarro, I know his team, and we used to discuss this a lot. I think what the objective was to replicate, almost franchise the Honda model, which is they're within an instance of real tariffs being imposed and being consequential, they would have been amongst the the least impacted automakers.
Correct.
They have 12 plants in the United States. So again, Trump really wanted to replicate that model, kind of franchise that they've got. As I recall, 12 plants in the U.S. And I think after Navarro said that, they built up another one, because I think we had a phone call about that. So Honda has at least 12 plants in the United States that make the Hondas and the Acuras. They make the engines. It makes the transmission. It makes a lot of the components. And of those, 4 of them were ranked in the top 10, at least as of last year, in terms of the amount of domestic content that it was making, including the Honda Odyssey, which is what we spent a lot of time on. I traveled to Lincoln, Alabama, and at least 50% of its content is domestic. China is very difficult because they've got a 25% tariff on all the imported vehicles, and they recently started imposing that against Harley Davidson and against motorcycles. So they offered to cut it.
That's why there's a huge black market for nice vehicles into China.
Yeah, and so so to get around the Chinese tariffs and to sell the vehicles into China, the automakers spent the last 20 years really building and then renovating and continuing to develop, which just costs so much money. We're talking about massive places the size of cities. They set up manufacturing facilities and joint ventures, right? So it's very difficult, and it takes a decade to unwind those. Also, because a lot of the goods and materials and even the human capital has to be paid so significantly far in advance. Sometimes these are 10-year contracts. So that's kind of my. I took too long saying that, right? But I'm so interested. Right. But that's my answer. So did the panic around the Trump tariffs manifest into reality? I don't think it did. I think there's lots of issues around Trump that I wish he had more support within his own administration and amongst Mitch McConnell and Mitch's wife. They were probably the biggest obstacles to some of these things happening. So can you add to that? I know I said a lot there.
Yeah, I can. So I wouldn't say any manifestation of it wasn't panic. It certainly imposes a huge burden on importers. And I'll use very quickly use the example. There is a company that manufactures furniture of a certain type. So the tariffs that were imposed are what we in the industry call Section 301. And so Section 301 tariffs, and then there's been just tons of tranches of these things issued, and then exemptions issued, and then exemptions that have expired. And so this company still is actively being punished under the Section 301s at a 25% tariff. Their product ordinarily is duty free. So when they set up their manufacturing relationships in China 15 years ago, say, and they were bringing stuff into the United States, that stuff was effectively coming in for free as far as the tax paid to Uncle Sam. They still had to pay a harbor maintenance fee and a merchandise processing fee, but those add up to maybe $100 for the whole container, for $200, depending on what the value of the goods is inside. Not much at all. Now with the imposition of the tariffs, yes, it is a punitive measure punishing China for not only their anti-competitive practices, but we have other means of addressing those. It was just basically putting a stick in the eye of China, which I get why Trump did it. There's a lot of reasons. It's a very complex issue politically why he made these choices. But what it has manifested into for this family or this family-owned company is that they import hundreds of containers a year of this product. Before it was duty-free. It cost them almost nothing except ocean freight to import. Now, all of a sudden, they're paying 25% on a $10,000, a $20,000, a $30,000 commercial invoice. You're talking a 25% cost of goods sold that they either have to eat, which they can't eat. There's no world in which they could eat that because the margins aren't that good on what they make, or they have to pass it through to the consumer. So now they're in an anti-competitive stance against other importers who are maybe having a product made like that in Vietnam and are getting it duty-free. So it has a very distributed impact at a large scale. We didn't see a lot of geopolitical panic, as it were. But at the small scale, it has an extremely directed, focused impact on anybody that it's hit. It's been very, very difficult for a lot of these people.
We're going to skip around just a tiny bit. We're going to talk about Space Force now. And I've got a guest in the back room that's kind of a surprise. And I guess maybe it's rude to you, and I don't want to be rude to you. This is a dinner, right?
No. Let's do it. Let's do it. We had a knock at the door. Come on in. Let's eat.
Yeah. So Dennis is here. Dennis, you're awesome. So I can't hear you. Turn off your. So Dennis is going to join us. We're going to talk really quickly with Dennis about Space Force, because Ross, you and I have discussed the dangers. You and I have discussed, Ross, the dangers of Amazon owning the monopoly on space logistics.
Yes.
So can you
Absolutely.
discuss that? And then I want Dennis to contribute to that conversation. And I think actually Rising Serpent, in the conversation we had with Dennis Wingo during the investor series number 11, was Rising Serpent actually asked about the fear of the cartelization of space. And one of the first ways that would express themselves is Jeff Bezos owning the logistics business of space. So Ross, can you discuss that? And then Dennis, can you contribute to that at all?
Yep.
Well, I mean, I'm certainly in the room here with a couple of intellectual giants. So, Dennis, it's nice to meet you, sir. The as to the concern of cartelization of space, you've got really two things happening here, where non-state actors have been able to really materially step into in a big way, right? Which is going to be your launch systems, the vehicles themselves that carry the payloads. That kind of stuff. You're talking an enormous financial cost. You're talking an enormous amount of infrastructure that needs to be in place for an Elon Musk or a Jeff Bezos or a Richard Branson to do what they're doing. So you have a very high barrier to entry. You also have a strong first mover advantage amongst these non-state actors, and that can be very quickly grow into Wayland Yutani of the alien world or the Omni consumer products, right, of the RoboCop world, where one company can move so fast and have so much regulatory capture and so much institutional advantage that they can just pull ahead before anybody even knows what's going on. So I do fear cartelization of space. I do think that there will be a lot of opportunities for smaller players, but right now, because of the cost of infrastructure and manufacturing and R&D and all of that, we run that risk if we don't find ways to distribute the opportunity, I guess, across a larger ecosystem.
And then we're going to go to Dennis in 1 second on it, but I want to add that your one of your ambitions is to be within the ecosystem of logistics of space. And then we're going to go on to Dennis, who's years ahead of you.
Very much so.
Yeah, he really is. And Dennis, would you mind just giving the 1 minute bio on yourself? And congratulations, because I think, did you say one of your photographs was used by NASA today? Is that right?
NASA was showing, HEOMD was showing some lunar surface activities. And that was some graphics that we did for NASA Langley relative to a piece of infrastructure, which is a crane on the surface of the moon. And I think you're right that, and just to give you the 1 minute first, I am a cat. I don't know why that's relevant, but I am a cat. And so worked the whole system from launch vehicles, space stations, lunar surface activities, in situ resource utilization, things like that. And a lot of the things that you say, and by the way, I want your email. You and I need to talk offline.
Sure.
I think there are amazing opportunities. I think the limiting factor right now for an Elon, and I count both Elon and Jeff as associates, there is so much to do that no one or two entities as of yet have the ability to dominate an off-planet infrastructure system. I talk logistics every single day with my customers.
No, it'll be so my heart. I love it.
The technologies that we're doing, and I love to say this is, the old saying that armchair generals talk about battles, generals talk about logistics. And I've been talking with the guys who talk about logistics. And so it's a very, very opportune, probably we're as close to a breakout for humanity into space as it is possible to get.
Now, let me ask you a question, Dennis, and to both of you, these are national interests. I mean, this is not just the megacorps. It's not just the tens of millions of jobs that are going to be created. It's, wars express themselves in a lot of ways. And when we're talking about supply chains, which is kind of the theme of this thing, that's a war. I mean, it's a war, and it's it's a war, and I think that Dennis had said during our investor series that generals talk about logistics.
Yeah, I mean, logistics, and I've loved what you've said today, is logistics. I helped with the Defense Department several years ago, or about 3 years ago now, looking ahead 25 years. Where are going to be the most important logistical and choke points? Like you were talking about the Strait of Hormuz. Where are the Straits of Hormuz in space?
Wow.
And so that is actively being discussed, it's actively being worked, and there are people actively looking into the future and developing systems looking in that direction, as well as logistical infrastructure.
So Yul Mentrado says, and thank you so much for joining us, UEL Mentrado. So hopefully I kind of put the sequence of letters together correctly. Can you help me better understand this? More subtle, Bezos versus Russian heavy rocket capacity.
May I take this one first?
Yeah, of course.
There is a vast gulf between capacity and will and innovation. I don't care what the Russian capacity to produce is. They no longer have the intellectual firepower at the top, like an Elon or a Jeff, to implement what they should be doing. And at the end of the day, I think it is here with private enterprise, and I don't want to say the word megacorps because at some point, yeah, they're all megacorps, but it is the innovation that is happening right now in the space industrial ecosystem that has the potential for us to leapfrog many of the supply chain issues of today. And we are looking ahead 20 years for what is going to be the products, the logistics, the raw materials, and the supply chain of 20 years from now.
So I want to thank Jan Gold for being here, and I want to address their question because it's very interesting. And we all want to be very respectful to the Biden administration because they've only been in there for a month, so there's a lot of unknowns, and there's a lot of who was it within the Bush administration who said unknown unknowns, right? There's
Donald Rumsfeld.
So I want to be very respectful because there is unknowns, right? So Jan Gold says, was that why NASA was defunded in the first place, to privatize space?
No, and it is much more pedantic and associated with the left-right divide. If you take a look at the people who were most against the space program in 1972, what were their names? Walter Mondale, Kennedy, Ted Kennedy, and the Democratic leadership. And what happened in April of 1968 when the Democratic convention was basically stormed. There was an insurrection at the Democratic convention. It scared the Democratic Party so terribly that they decided to take a populist Great Society view and divert the funding and divert an entire 20-year stretch of investment in technology that had started at the end of, or even at the beginning of World War II, and divert that to social programs. And that is where Peter Thiel starts talking about from 0 to 1, that we haven't had the advances since that era of that shift. Because if you take a look at it, NASA's a rounding error in the department, in multiple department budgets. And I've done a blog showing the relative growth of these other entities. If we were putting, 150, 200, 300 billion a year in space, we would transform the world in a decade. So what happened, the government stepped away from space, but now it's taken us 35 to 40 years for the inflection point to where private enterprise and the finance to where people like Elon and Jeff who now are people who love space and who are dedicating their lives, just like Bill Boeing, Jack Northrop, and those guys did to aviation. That's the difference.
Mm-hmm.
But so let's pick it up where we are now, where, the first thing that we've seen, the last thing that we saw out of the Trump administration, and now the very first thing that we've seen out of the Biden administration is a lack of funding of some very, very key programs. And I think everybody needs to be respectful of the Biden administration because there's a lot unknown. But what is known is that shortfall is going to be picked up by the oligarchs. I mean, it is what it is. Or am I mistaken? What's your thought?
Well, no, because what's happening, our needs are so dire, and again, go to what has been said here today in our supply chains and all, that the government I'm going to use the word government broadly, is very understanding of the challenges that we have and what we have to do to invest to get out of it. And it's not just Jeff, and there's a lot of things that you can do that don't take a lot of money, but that can have a large influence going down the road. And those things are being invested in. But the problem is it's philosophy. It's just like, again, you have the left-right philosophical divide. On the left, if you're concerned about climate change, if you look underneath the rhetoric, it is, we only have this one world, and so we got to preserve it. On the right, and actually a lot of people, and it's more than just left-right, there's a tremendous number of people now that say that no, that is not the right way, that we have a whole universe out there and we can expand and maintain civilization. But there's a fundamental, and this is why you see, let's don't fund NASA, let's fund all this other stuff. Well, it is our position that by funding space and technological development, all these problems that you want to fund the other direction will be solved. But it's a philosophy. It's not, oh, I want to defund space so the oligarchs can take over.
So let's move on. And I want to thank, and again, as I remind everybody, I speak many languages, and I'm fluent in many languages because I love language. However, I pronounce nothing right. So I'll speak Hindi when I'm in India, and I'll speak Mandarin when I'm in China because they're much more forgiving. But in the U.S., they're not. The kids who barely speak it themselves are not forgiving, so they're always going to correct me. So I just learned not to say anything. I could be mispronouncing this, and I'm going to try. And Jorge and I have spoken through DM a lot, so I really appreciate you being here. Asks, and we're going to go back into the wars of trade and supply routes in just a moment, because people may not realize, but supply routes now go into space. They just have, it's just an amazing thing. So Jorge, thank you so much for being here. Says, and I love that picture, by the way. So says, what are some publicly traded companies that are leading our space exploration?
There are very few of them. There are these new SPACs, the special purpose acquisition corporations, that are now going public. I would say caveat emptor on all right now, just like any other investment. But in the defense contractors, the Lockheeds and the Boeings, they are defense contractors. And if you know the market, and you know this much better than I do, they're traded at a small multiple of their contract values. But there are companies like that built the Mars lander. They did a really great job. But I would say look more, there's an ETF coming out that's a space ETF very soon. I would go with that or something like that. I would be wary of individual companies at this instant.
So now what are the pure plays? We just saw Lockheed make an acquisition to compete with SpaceX. Right now, I think everybody's trying to compete with SpaceX in terms of building a downstream ecosystem and building capacity on the launch side. So where are you seeing innovation amongst the top publicly traded companies? Because SPACs do have limitations in terms of the availability of the shares, right?
Yeah.
Where are you seeing where a person can make an investment? Everybody knows I'm a large shareholder in Boeing, right? There's public disclosure of that also. So that was my pick. And I've been through plane crashes before with McDonnell Douglas. So for me, this is nothing new going back 30 years. So where are you seeing of the tier one companies' innovation and improvement in earnings from space and war, because war is space these days? And what are the downstream companies that you're seeing that might be likely growth or even more likely acquisition, purchased?
Well, I think your last statement is the best one. The acquisitions are going to go the other direction. Right now, personally, I've worked with the Lockheed people, and I respect the Lockheed engineering teams greatly. I've worked with the Advanced Projects Group out of Palo Alto, the Northrop Grumman folks, and just as a disclosure, I sold my patent for own orbit servicing to Orbital ATK, which is now Northrop Grumman, and they did the world's first commercial own orbit servicing mission last year. So, they're not completely moribund, but what happens is that these large corporations like the Lockheeds and all, they are looking for risk to be retired. And it's like why Northrop Grumman bought Scale Composites, Burt Rutan's company. Burt had retired the risk on composites. And so, okay, that's a good acquisition. And Northrop Grumman actually acquired Orbital Sciences, which Orbital Sciences started out in the late 1980s as an entrepreneurial launch company.
Yeah,
and so that's what I would look for, is to look for the large corporations that are looking to do acquisitions in this space to build their portfolios. And I don't know who those are right now, but it's something to look for.
And then I want to add one more question to that, and then I want to go back to the war aspect of it. So JB Lessons has a follow-up to that, right? So as tech flattens industries and brings it closer to the individual, is space an area where it can't be flattened? And they add to that, as I type this, you may be answering with private industry's ability to be in space now. And actually the question wasn't answered. So as the tech does flatten industries, right? Is space a place right now where it really can't?
I think it can, because, and we're doing some work in this area. For example, we're looking to help update the latest generation of processors to be used in space. The aerospace industry is horribly decrepit in terms of their avionics capabilities. And we're working on a new generation of avionics to help fix that. So there are opportunities for small players of dedicated workers, just like any startup here in Silicon Valley, to have a product that fits a niche that can be a very key niche going forward in space. And I think software is going to be the big difference in space.
Wow. And this was a question that also came up by several people, actually, in the Investor Series number 11 that we did about Space Force. And we're going to be doing a couple more, right? But so Kiera RK, again, thank you so much for joining us. Ask a question for both of you guys, because both of you guys are kind of logistics, but in a kind of different realm, right? But where can we go to work in the logistics of space? And before you guys answer that, one of the happiest moments I ever have is when I see a kid wearing like a NASA jersey or a T-shirt, because they don't sell those in department stores, and they're not really going to purchase that from Amazon. They're going to have gone to NASA. Is very, very open with giving walking tours, and they're like, it's ridiculous. Even SpaceX now is really opening their doors, and they've got like a docent program. It's just really remarkable. So I know how that kid acquired their jersey, and I'm just so proud, or their T-shirt. So Kiera RK says, where can we go to work in the logistics of space? What are the companies and what are the jobs?
Well, tune into my company's website in a few months. But there are other companies like my friend Dan Faber's Orbit Fab. There's several companies that are doing that. Follow me on Twitter. Follow Adam on Twitter. I'm tied into just about everybody doing it. Even I have a friend, John Goff, who there's Voyager Holdings, Redwire. There's several of these aggregators of small companies, and that's another trend that you'll see, Adam, is that somebody comes in and they have a pile of cash and they aggregate a bunch of small companies into something bigger, which could really grow into the next generation megacorp beyond the Musk and the Bezoses.
Do you know
Sort of
that
a Y Combinator for space.
I just went to Orbit Fab's website, and I had no idea what they did. I'm just so fascinated by Space Force, and it actually gets into supply chains, which again is it appears tangential. It appears kind of like almost factual.
Essential.
Yeah. So and they identify themselves. They say we are creating the in-orbit infrastructure needed to get humans into space, starting with the first in-orbiting propellant depot. So they describe themselves as a gas stations in space.
Yeah.
Is that sick?
I love it.
Well, I mean, Dan's got a good idea, and I think it's a valuable thing, and you'll be seeing some things from us later this year as well. And I think we're about to have an explosion of new efforts. And as we move out toward the moon, you're going to see an entirely different world in 10 years in space.
And so I want to go on with two comments, and we're going to talk about war and to supply chains because it's so important on Earth. Reader, and I'm going to give the numbers because I like doing that. Reader 1228-15335. Thank you so much for joining us. And
I think that's their gym locker code.
Yeah, I always wonder if those numbers are just kind of randomly generated, or if that means something to them. So Rita, thank you for joining us, and we're talking about companies that kind of are the innovators and where we can have pure plays in space, right? That's all what we're looking for as investors. We're all investors, right? If we know that the future is in space, the future is war and the future is in space, then we really need to grab those investments. So they're thinking about Maxar, MAXR, and their comment is they built the robot arm on the Mars robot.
Well, Maxar is a company in this space, and they are like the 42nd generation descendant of Ford Aerospace.
Are they really?
Yeah, that originally was Ford Aerospace.
You know what? I remember that. You know what? I had no idea.
Yeah.
I remember when they were just doing components for computers too.
Yeah, Ford Aerospace, and it was right here alongside the road, right here in Silicon Valley. And then Loral bought them, and then Loral screwed it up, and then Bernie Schwartz and all that crap and all of the things that happened there. And so they went through all their ups and downs, and it became Maxar, then it became Loral, then it's just a big mess. But again, and just like any investment, just be very careful, look and see what their future ideas are, and who their leadership is.
I'm the biggest bull on the stock market in all of history. So I am not too contemplative. I don't have a lot of negotiations with my inner Damon, right? We don't get into a lot of fights about investments, except for Bitcoin. I did, because it was 21,000 and now it's like 50. Somebody just posted on here. I appreciate whoever did. They said Bitcoin's now at 56,000. It's ridiculous. And I remember Rising Serpent, I have a good memory, asked about the economy of space. At what point does the moon economy, right? Because there's going to be obviously a moon economy. At what point does it dislocate from the earthbound economy? And I guess Bitcoin might be some part of that.
Dislocate, I think, a lot of people talk about there's a big difference between self-sustainable and self-sufficient. We're going to be self-sustaining long before it's self-sufficient. And things like very high-value products like diamond glass. Could you imagine diamond glass? Diamond glass right now costs about $2 million.
Do you know who stole? Do you know that one of the reasons that Huawei is in trouble, and Grace Meng, who is the the CFO and one of the founders' daughters, and she was kind of held in Canada until Trudeau let her go.
Oh yeah.
Because that's what Trudeau does, right? Is one of the things that they had stolen, right? It was the third, and it was unfiled from the Department of Justice, was stealing some of the innovation behind diamond glass.
Yeah, well, diamond glass is a big deal, but right now it's god awfully expensive. We think we can bring the price down by a factor of 100. So can you imagine diamond glass canopies for jet fighters?
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to go on just a little bit, So
And
really,
Adam, I'm going to need to go, my friend.
yeah, thanks a lot. So I just want to say one thing in parting. Thank you again so much for being here, Dennis, because we're gonna start concluding. And one of the things I want to start concluding with after you go is I'm going to put this comment on just so you can say goodbye to that comment. But one of the is about how these days what I'm seeing is also not just the war in trade supply chains and who's winning that war in terms of shipping and air, but it now immediately impacts what goes into space. And I think Elon Musk was very recently discussing this about now how he's seeing bottlenecks, and now he's just going to have to start making everything locally.
Well, Elon just invented a new stainless steel alloy for the Starship because he needed to optimize it because what was produced in the market didn't quite meet his needs. And I think robot spiders exactly right. They need to start teaching Verilog, Libero, and all these FPGA languages. We need a revolution in education, and that's what I'll leave you with today.
Thank you so much, and we're going to start concluding. So, Dennis, you're the best. You're always so informative. You're awesome. See you later, Dennis. Oh, you see that? I caught him in mid-flight. So
I'll send him my email.
Yeah, definitely. So I want to conclude, and I want to thank everybody here, but I'm not ready to conclude just yet because, but you're not going to break the record for the longest ever. Is supply chains? I think of them now as a war, right? Mm-hmm. Where the world is being bifurcated between us, and I discussed this with Valina during one of the investor series, where the world is really being bifurcated for the first time in our lives between China and the U.S., while as before, countries in Europe could just have this ad hoc picking and choosing kind of opportunistically and conveniently, partners and allies, including in shipping, obviously, that those days are over. So in terms of the phraseology of war, which is how you described it in the beginning, who's winning?
China. Right now, China is. To an extent, though, they are still so interdependent on us and our dollars and our ability to move mountains of currency into their economy, and to keep their factories moving. If we totally collapse, and this is why my thesis is not that China wants to destroy the United States. They don't want that. They do want us to be an extremely lucrative, boxed in hegemon who exists on the other sphere, because we built up so much together in the last 40 years. Ripping those apart would be mutually assured destruction. Now, is she crazy enough to pull that off? Maybe. But at the end of the day, I really am taking the long-term view that the world that will exist between us is going to be the U.S. still dominating the Anglosphere. To some extent, you're going to have the Quad. To some extent, you're going to have a Western Hemisphere sort of Fortress America's emphasis, is what will sort of fall into little bits of transatlantic. But for the most part, I think Eurasia is going to belong to predominantly China, and to the extent that Russia and China continue to be able to get along and find ways to work together, maybe like the northern sphere of influence of Eurasia is going to be more Russian, whereas the southern and western is going to be more Chinese. So I think that's the world we are heading towards for the most part, and everybody's going to start to benchmark their own behaviors and attitudes.
But so I want to understand when you say that China is winning, and we're going to close on this note, right? But I want to understand when you say that China is winning, how do we observe that war? Because most Americans, well, all Americans except for you, we don't see any evidence of a war being played out. But for you, this is your everyday life.
Mm-hmm. So everything, the balance of trade is driven by what is able to be produced in China and what's able to be produced in the United States. So that means all of the air freight that we have coming in, everything that is the origin. It begins there, right? China has now achieved the largest heavy shipbuilding industry in the world. They have 7 of the 10 largest ports in the world. Almost everything that flows to or from China moves through, if not China proper, at least its ports, because it's transshipped, right? Kaohsiung in Taiwan is a very large transshipment port. Singapore and Malaysia, well, Singapore's its own thing, of course, but geographically, Malaysia is its closest analog, right there at the Strait of Malacca, and then Busan in Korea. Those are your 3 biggest transship ports right there. The other 7 largest ports in the world are Chinese. right? So it's one of these situations where, and then Rotterdam's up on the list, but so you have the situation where they have, if not a direct veto, they certainly have a heckler's veto over the territorial waters, South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, the East China Sea, these regions where maybe it's theirs, maybe it's not. That's not really up for debate, though, but they certainly have the largest Navy besides us in the region.
So how can we actually observe who's winning the war is really what I'm interested in. How can we observe even the skirmishes? How can we observe the battles? In the old days, you knew you lost the war when the enemy came in and killed you.
So the second we stop conducting frequent freedom of navigation operations within the claimed territorial waters, the second we start living outside the first island chain with our Navy instead of inside of it, we're going to have ceded a very, very important domain. Because at that point, then we've allowed some combination of Chinese naval belligerents, their fishing and Coast Guard militia activity, the gray zone activities, and then their missiles have pushed us outside that first island chain. That will be a de facto concession that basically we plant our flag in Okinawa, we plant our flag in Guam, and we don't really come any closer. That I think will tell us everything we need to know. You will also start to see it when China begins intra-Asia trade begins to expand and increase. When you start to see some of these just accessions of people are buying from China when maybe they weren't before, or they're buying more from China for certain things.
Okay, so we're going to ask one last question, and then we're going to go. But it's a very interesting question because we discuss this a lot, and now we're discussing it in a kind of a context of China because there's a war between them, and Pakistan is no longer that much of a military threat. Whether that's a good thing or not, I'll let other people decide because I don't want to be offensive to everybody, and it's to anybody, and it's a complicated thing. I've made my position clear on these things. But so now there's no longer kind of that proxy in the middle. There's just an immediate battles being fought between China and India. And what happens if China just seizes up all the supply chains and fights the war against India, which wants to now be the head of the syndicate for trade, right? What happens if China? How would China stop India from succeeding in their supply chain building up and from their syndicate? And how would we see? How would we be able to observe that? What would they do, and how would we be able to observe it?
Well, it's pretty clear the strategy that they're taking right now is looking towards hegemonic control of both the eastern and western, outside the territorial waters or outside the EEZ of India. You look at what they did; they basically got control of the port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka, right there off India's southern seaboard. They've got Gwadar. They're trying at least to expand their naval footprint, along the coastline of Myanmar and Thailand to the east. So India has these territories there. And India has a very strong navy. They are one of the largest standing militaries in the world. They have a rapidly modernizing defense and high-tech industry. So they're developing some of these ways that they can kind of try to keep China out. But at the end of the day, China's trying to plant infrastructure flags that gives them the right and the opportunity to basically say, you can't approach the shores of India unless you come through us.
So are you saying that they're gonna use that as a tactic to squeeze out the routes, the maritime routes?
I think so.
And
I think that's why they want to be in Djibouti, Gwadar. They want to be in some of the, along the Andamans and things like that there in the eastern, kind of the eastern waters. They want to say, India, you are free to be as powerful as you want to be right there.
And I think we're going to close on that. I'm going to scroll to the bottom, but I really like this last note. And I see that somebody provided, and Little Herc has joined us, so thank you so much. And I see that we've run 2 hours and 23 minutes. So you haven't caught up with the one I did yesterday with Ron Coleman, which was a little bit longer, but you've beaten Darren Beatty. So Darren Beatty, it gets pushed into third place. He's not going to like that.
Well, he's clearly got to come back on because Darren Beatty has a lot more valuable stuff to say than I do most of the time. So
this has been awesome. There are so many clips from this that I'm going to create particularly about the supply chains and the wars, and it's just amazing. It's amazing stuff. So I just want to make sure I've captured all the comments. So I think I have for now in terms of the closing comments, because this is the comment that people are going to see as I close up. So I really want to thank Ross Kennedy. You don't like that, do you? I really want to thank.
A little weird.
Yeah, I know. I really want to thank, and for those who might have missed it, Ross Kennedy goes by a Twitter handle, which was an anonymous of man integrated. Man_integrated, and truly an expert on it. I mean, just truly kind of the go-to for so many people about trade and about supply chains. And these days, he's really amongst the top leading indicators. He probably doesn't even realize it. But because there's nothing known about China's finances right now, its municipal health, its municipal debt, its municipal bond debt, and the strength of its AIIB or the strength of its Exim Bank, because there's so many countries that are vulnerable right now, and they're all going through renegotiations. I'm going to bore people with this stuff, but you're really a leading indicator of what's about to happen. So it was very, very helpful. And I see the comment that I like better. So Felder Renzos, thank you so much, and what a beautiful picture of your child you've shared. I found another comment though, and I like it. So that's another war. Wars express themselves in a lot of ways, and you just lost that war. That was like the Twitter comment war. So thank you so much. I see another comment. So I'm going to put this up there now that you've been exposed. And I want you to understand, I'm glad you did, take off, the mask, because you're now pretty much one of the leading authorities. I mean, you are just the person you are. And it's been such a service, when you were a non, and it's such a service now. And but everybody should delete all their historic tweets. And I was telling Ross about that earlier, and that's because nobody needs the volatility, right? These are crazy times, and there's just no reason to create that. I don't think it's even a vulnerability for people who are true experts at things, as Ross is, but it's an issue of volatility, right? Not vulnerability, but volatility, and I think that's different. So,
agreed.
I got to go back to Dal Whippers. So Dal Whooper, we're going to close with this one. So the Whooper Nation, thank you so much for saying that, who says this has been an amazing discussion. Thank you. And I want to thank everybody for joining us, and particularly, to you, Ross. And we've been the guest on so many people's Twitter feeds today, and I guess on their YouTube destination, like a vacation. And I just really want to thank everybody for joining us. I had so much fun.
Absolutely. This kind of stuff's extraordinary, man. I'll talk to a tree about it. So it's nice that I'm able to, talk to an audience that's interested in that as well. So it's very dry in a lot of ways, but when you begin to sort of unpack how the world really works, and you begin to see things in a different way, it feels like having a crystal ball sometimes.
You're awesome. So I'm going to click that end broadcast button. You can't see it. It's on my side. And everybody's going to say goodbye, except for you, Ross. You're going to stay with me, right? So, but everyone else is going to disappear. So again, I want to thank everybody so much for welcoming us as guests on your feed. And I had a lot of fun. I think it was really informative. And this is the dinner that we all would have had the world not changed so much, right? But it
Absolutely.
Worked. So I want to thank everybody, and I'm going to press that button, and then we're all going to go away. And everybody have a great weekend. And Ross, stay with me.